now the wealthiest 3 Australians, who could comfortably sit in the back of a limousine, had as much wealth as the poorest 1 million Australians, about the population of Adelaide. But we still have this strong egalitarian culture, which is, of course, central to who we are as Labor people, as Fabians, but I think it's also important to much of Australian identity. We're a nation that doesn't much like tipping, where we tend to sit in the front seat of taxis. We don't stand up when the Prime Minister enters the room, and that's not just because it's Tony Abbott, it's the way we are. Lots of other countries have private areas on their beaches, but Australia doesn't. And we've had former senior bankers with names like Nugget and Noggy. And that great Australian egalitarian tradition is something that we need to treasure, because it's one of the things that makes us who we are. So revise it about making sure that we curtail the growth in economic inequality really matters. We'll talk, I'm sure, about a range of the policy suggestions there, but off the top of my head I would be thinking about things such as not cutting the top marginal tax rate further, which was a policy both parties went to the 2007 election with. Making sure that unions have the power to organise in workplaces, because there's no other organisation as powerfully committed to reducing inequality as unions. And ensuring that we've got great education, plausibly better education for the most vulnerable than for the most affluent. That we don't have a situation where teachers start their careers teaching poor kids and finish their careers teaching rich kids.
What's your perspective?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for inviting us to come across. Income inequality is becoming more obvious to me in the 10 years that I've spent negotiating with companies like Coles and Woolworths, trying to get pay rises for, generally speaking, low-skilled workers. Enterprise bargaining or collective bargaining is the mechanism that we use to try and maximise the return that low-skilled workers get for their labour. And it is getting harder and harder and harder. And that's happening at the same time as the profits of the companies that those workers are working for is continuing to go through the roof. Recently, in the supermarket sector of the retail industry, we had Australia's highest paid executive getting paid $15.6 million per annum in running Coles, and good luck to him. But at the very same time as those pay rises for him were being announced, we were in EBA negotiation with Coles, and they were doing their best to try and get us to agree to a wage rise that was less than inflation at the time. And we're the good news story, because at least with Coles and Woolworths, we're in the room making an argument because we've got a high level of union membership density with those companies. The really sad part about the story is, of course, where we're not able to represent workers because they're not unionised. And in those segments of the retail industry, those workers are entirely dependent upon the decision of the Fair Work Commission when it comes to the minimum wage review. And consistently, some of those decisions recently have not been taking into account the increasing profitability of the Australian retail industry. And we're just one example of one industry. So for me, at the coalface, trying to negotiate good outcomes where wages get a dividend from incredibly profitable industries, it's becoming far more difficult. And I mean, I could go on forever about the range of reasons for that, but there are a range of reasons for that, and it worries me that when it comes to at least to industrial relation policies, amongst others, the debate seems to be entirely skewed towards arguments that are about disarming the capacity for organisations like mine to be able to get an outcome for working people.
So just one nuance I would start with in the broader story. I think it's important to lay down a foundation for this, and that is that prosperity in Australia is growing overall, and that's a really important context for the rising inequality that we see. So we heard Penny say earlier that we've had 24 years of uninterrupted economic growth, and that's a really great thing. And what we have seen, and I'm sure John will talk more about this, I don't want to steal your thunder, but we have seen incomes across right across the Australian community go up in general as a result of that. There are small exceptions to that. One of them is people who are living on unemployment benefits whose quality of life is actually probably lower than it was 20 years ago. But for the vast majority of Australians, they have benefited from the increased prosperity that we've seen in this country. So I think that's important So I think that means that as progressive people, it's incumbent on us to explain whether and why inequality continues to matter when we're all growing more prosperous. That's a fundamental question. I feel really strongly that inequality still matters even though overall households are growing more prosperous. And I can just give you lots of reasons, but the one I'll focus on today, as a Labor Member of Parliament, my core purpose in life is to make sure that a child who's growing up in the most low-income part of my electorate has just as good a chance as being a High Court judge or a CEO of an ASX 200 company as someone who's growing up in Warringah in Tony Abbott's electorate. And we know from some of the really important work that Andrew's lead has done over here is that rising inequality jeopardises this. And we see it everywhere. Where we have more inequality, we have less of a meritocracy. So when we look at the billionaires list in Australia, 90% of the people on that list are pale and male. When we think about access to education in Australia, we know that a child who grows up in a very low-income household is 5 times less likely to sit in a university lecture theatre than one who grows up in a very high-income household. Now that, to me, is a very big problem. So what are we going to do about it? I think that's important before we get to that question to say, why is this happening to us? So we do observe growing inequality across most developed countries in the world. And one of the really important drivers of this is the way that our economy is changing because of technology and globalisation. So a good little quick example I'll give is about Kodak, the company that made cameras and film for a very long time. At its peak, Kodak employed 145,000 people just directly, so the supply chain that sold on film employed many more. Kodak went bust in 2012, a victim of the digital revolution, and the company that kind of took over the mantle as the key photographic company in the world is Instagram, which is an online company. Now, a few months after Kodak went bust in 2012, Instagram was bought by Facebook for $1 billion, and the company had 13 employees. So this is an industry where 145,000 people were sharing the benefits of all of the wealth that was created, and probably less wealth, if in fairness, is created by Instagram, but just 13 employees there were sharing that. So what we're seeing, that's a sort of very extreme example of something we see right across our economy, and that is that technology is driving wages up at the top, but also holding them down at the bottom, because anyone who's working in a job that can potentially be replaced by a machine at some point is potentially out of work or going to have their wages held down. So just quickly on policy reform. So as I said, the key thing for me is how do we make sure as many Australians as possible benefit from the economic changes that are taking place instead of be victims of it. And this, to me, is very much an education story, because when we look at the people who are getting more and more prosperous in Australia, it's the people who have got skills. The more we can help lower income households, the kids growing up in those households stay at school for as long as they can to go on to further study, then I think that's when we start to see that we're distributing the great benefits of growing prosperity in Australia amongst as many people as we can.
Great. I think, John, many of us who've seen you on Q&A with Joe Hockey over the last some time have enjoyed your sparring with him. But what's your perspective?
Well, I'll start by emphasising where Claire started, that essentially for almost all Australians, they are in a substantially better position than they were 30 years ago. And that's not to be sniffed at. When you look at the bottom 20% of households, they've seen their real incomes go up by in the order of 35% over a 15-year period. That's a lot. So for a household that, say, has got an income of $50,000, without that growth, it'd be a lot more like about $35,000. So maybe 38. Andrew can do that. So it is a big shift. When we think about economic development, which does lead to people at the bottom being better off, and that's important, and inequality, those things are sometimes aligned and they're sometimes in tension. There's some things that we can do that, at least in theory, will help both of those things. So, for example, if we can genuinely improve education, particularly for children at the bottom, and for adults at the bottom as well, then that will have an impact positively on both inequality and economic growth. If we see improvements in female workforce participation, the same is true. If we look at our city shapes and the work that Jane Frances Kelly and Paul Donegan did on city limits for Grattan Institute, shows the way that we've got essentially a growing divide between the centres and the edges of our cities, with essentially people who live in the centre access to a lot of jobs, by and large high incomes, by and large relatively high levels of education, by and large, and this is a really interesting one, high levels of female workforce participation, and then people who live right on the edge, by and large lower levels of education, lower access to jobs, and correspondingly much lower levels of female workforce participation. And that's an inequality which is not good for Australia in general. It does lead to some people not understanding how the other 90% live, and then occasionally they say things that maybe they shouldn't. And it also, though, leads to a much less successful economy, because if a substantial proportion of your population can't get to jobs, then you wind up with a much poorer match between the skills of the population and the demands of what it is that's productive activity. So those are things where they're nicely aligned. But we do live in the real world in which there are trade-offs. We can do things that will reduce inequality. So we can, for example, tighten up on superannuation tax concessions, and we can tighten up on negative gearing, and we can reduce capital gains tax. And don't get me wrong, I've written about why I think all of those are good ideas, and they will reduce inequality, but at the margins they will also reduce economic growth by some. Now, those are examples of things where I don't think they will reduce economic growth by very much, and they'll have a big impact on inequality, and therefore it's a trade-off worth making. But we need to acknowledge that sometimes there are real life trade-offs. And of course there are trade-offs in the opposite direction. There are things that have a really substantial impact on economic growth, and of course that does ultimately wind up leading to growth in incomes at the bottom, but which have a marginal reduction in inequality. So a good example of this, I would suggest, is increasing ages at which you can access pension and superannuation. Would have a material impact in the long run on economic growth, because it encourages older workforce participation. Yes, as Andrew will point out, it does increase inequality, but I would suggest that's a trade-off worth making. One could make, perhaps more controversially, an argument that minimum wages do something a little different. In fact, you could make a really controversial argument and say that minimum wages are terrific for anyone who's got a job and not very good for the people who are the most deprived in our society, namely the unemployed. I'm acutely aware of where I'm making that call, but actually you talk to a large number of economists and they'll say that's exactly what they do. So those are the trade-offs that are involved. As I said, sometimes these things are nicely aligned, but we will wind off as a country in a worse place if we never acknowledge some of the trade-offs and say some of the time we want to do things which will reduce inequality, but also reduce economic activity a bit. Some of the times we want to do things which will increase economic activity a lot and increase inequality a bit, but that's a trade-off worth making. Thanks. So there's two big trends we see going on in home ownership. One is that young people are much less likely to own homes than they used to be. And in fact, middle-aged people are much less likely to own homes than they used to be as well. It's not just 25 to 34-year-olds who are not getting into the housing market, it's 35 to 44-year-olds as well. And indeed, we're even now seeing home ownership for 45 to 54-year-olds starting to fall. And my guess is that we're essentially seeing a cohort come through, and if current trends continue, we'll continue to see home ownership fall for essentially everybody except those who are already quite old and who already own their own houses. The second trend that we are seeing is one in which those who are on low incomes are much less likely to own their own homes than they used to be. That's where home ownership has really fallen off most. It used to be true that if you were at kind of about the 25th percentile in terms of income, your chances of owning a home were pretty high and not that much lower than someone on a really high income. The world has changed. If you're on a low income now, chances are you are going to be renting. More so if you're young, but that's a big shift in our housing market. And then the third thing, of course, is that it's all very well to talk about owning homes, so the question is what kind of home and where. And of course, again, there's a trade-off. The answer, of course, is that we'd all like to live in a two-storey home with about 8 bedrooms and a swimming pool and a tennis court about a kilometre from the CBD, preferably with hot and cold running servants. But the world isn't like that. The reality is that you have to make trade-offs, and if you're going to live close to the city, as many people want to do, and of course that's where a large number of the jobs, and particularly the more productive jobs, are being created, then chances are it's going to be something smaller. But the big opportunity is in what I would describe as the middle ring of our cities. We've actually done a pretty good job of building a lot more apartments in the centre of our big cities. We've done a very good job of building a lot of houses right at the edge of our cities, particularly in Melbourne, less so in Sydney. But we've done a pretty poor job of improving the number of houses that we create in the middle ring of our cities, what you might describe as the Glen Iris and Camberwells of this world. And ironically, that's where it's most important. And we have resisted any kind of subdivision in those areas. And I'm not necessarily talking about building everything in Camberwell to 12 stories, but if you take many of those plots of land and have 2-storey townhouses on them, you can wind up with very substantial increases in density that don't have enormous impacts on the people next door, apart from the fact that they will no longer be living next to people quite like them. And that's actually probably the big opportunity. There's a lovely piece of work that's been done out of Harvard, which essentially shows that if you try and understand in America's fast-growing cities which have seen big jumps in inequality and which haven't, it ultimately comes down to zoning, essentially the American word for planning. If you lock up your middle suburbs, then what happens when you get economic growth is a lot of the value of economic growth gets capitalised into scarce house prices, which is exactly what is happening in Australia. If you make it much easier to subdivide, then yes, people have to live next door to people who are not necessarily quite like them. And yes, I won't have quite as much, leafy green in Camberwell as I had yesterday, although I might well have almost as much leafy green. It's just there's going to be more people living there. But you will also see much less in the growth of inequality. And I think for a long time we've thought about planning policy as being, what does my backyard look like? We need to start understanding that it has an enormous impact on both economic development, because if people can't get into the CBD and the areas around it, you pay a price in terms of lower economic growth, and also you pay a price in terms of the fair go, because very few people can wind up living with access to those jobs. Now, you can also do things in terms of taxation policy. Negative gearing and capital gains tax arrangements are certainly not helping. They are certainly pushing up the price of housing. They are certainly at the margins leading to more houses owned by investors rather than by people who are living in them. But those things are not the main game. The main game is around planning. Don't get me wrong, negative gearing should go. There's no reason for it that I can see. It's not serving any particularly helpful social purpose, and it's costing the Treasury a lot of money. And if you have a tax policy which is costing the Treasury a lot of money, then it should go unless there's a really good reason. So that's what I think we need to do. We need to acknowledge that the situation in housing does have issues for inequality, that the main villain in the piece, if anything, is planning, but our tax policy is certainly not helping either.
We know that in Australia, home ownership's been a realisable dream for lots of very ordinary families, and that's what's disappearing. So home ownership has played an equalising force in Australia for a long time, and because it's disappearing, that's driving growing wealth inequality. So I just want to join in on the general condemnation of negative gearing here, because again, from the inequality point of view, there's issues around how this affects housing markets. But there's also additional inequality effects because we're effectively giving a tax break that we know on the data goes to the people who have the most wealth. So I think 60% of investor housing debt in Australia is owned by the top 25% of income earners. So these are the people that are benefiting from the big tax break. So as John's saying, if there's not a really good policy rationale for why we would give a really big tax break to the wealthiest people in the country, then maybe we need to consider where that policy should go. So just one other thing to say about housing policy. I talked a little bit before about kind of fundamental drivers of inequality and how the labour market is changing in a way that may mean inevitably some level of greater inequality in Australia. That's just what we see across all OECD countries, and I think there's a real question about whether, even with the full force of government, we can stop some level of growing inequality. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But I think if we are going to accept that a more prosperous country means a different kind of labour market, we need to do a lot to make sure that people at the bottom don't have an awful quality of life, because that's just not fair. If we're going to accept more inequality in Australia in incomes, then let's make sure we've got a really good quality of life for people, great public education, good parks, just the general things that make living life worth, good. And one of the things that we know is that, commuting is a horrendous bane for lots of families, and it's no laughing matter. For lower income families, they spend more time getting to and from work than they do with their kids in an ordinary working day, and that's a major problem. So cities policy it should be front and centre of this inequality conversation, because this is about the type of house that people live in, how far they have to go to and from work, what kind of job they're able to access, and beyond just the housing density questions, what sort of public transport do we have that makes all of our parts of our city a great place to live? Where are we thinking about jobs, where jobs will be located to make sure people don't have to commute?
Those of you who've read the 700-page book Thomas Piketty wrote about inequality will know that his basic thesis is that inequality is a story between those who have capital and those who don't. That hasn't actually been the main driver of inequality in Australia and the US over the course of the last generation, and Thomas acknowledges that in his book. But it is a potential for future inequality. That it could be that we increasingly have an Australia where the gap between the haves and the have-nots is defined by those who have wealth and those who don't, and that housing is playing a major part in that. I just shook my head this week hearing Joe Hockey say if housing was unaffordable, no one would be buying it. I can't remember who pointed it out, but someone said that sentence actually works if you take just about anything else and drop it in for where the word housing is. So you can say, if diamond-crusted iPhone covers were unaffordable, no one would be buying them. And the fact is that when central bankers use words like crazy, sensible politicians sit up and take notice. But also, we need to be thinking about the role of public transport in making this work. The Rudd and Gillard governments can have reasonable criticisms made of them, but one thing that you can't criticise them for is not investing in urban public transport. They invested more in urban public transport than all the other federal governments, going back to federation, put together. And yet now we've got a federal government that's washing its hands of urban public transport, perhaps driven by Tony Abbott's view that in the car an individual is king. That makes no sense for a rapidly growing Australia where we're locked up in a relatively small number of cities given our population. We need better public transport as a way of helping build housing affordability in exactly the way John's talked about in those middle ring suburbs. The last thing you need is NIMBYs like Barry O'Farrell cancelling medium development along the North Shore train line. Because those sorts of developments are exactly what will provide affordable housing opportunities for the middle class.
I'm from Adelaide, and housing prices in Adelaide are a lot cheaper than what they are in the eastern states. So we don't have the same problem that occurs in Sydney or Melbourne. That said, I'm very conscious that it's a real issue. I'm a big supporter of dealing with the issue of negative gearing. I think it's a no-brainer. But when we talk about housing affordability, the debate at the moment tends to be skewed towards taxation policy or planning policy, all really important reforms. But I think so much of it comes down to the quality of the income that you're receiving. And that's not to say that Joe Hockey is right, it's to say he's completely wrong. Because Joe Hockey's remarks this week about people just need to get a good job implies that a lot of working people who do have very good jobs, very important jobs in our communities, should just earn more. But yet everything this government seems to be doing in respect to wages policy is to suppress the capacity of working people to be able to earn more. And I think that whenever we talk about cost of living issues, whether it be the cost of a house or whether it be the cost of electricity bills, governments tend to spend politicians spend a lot of time talking about how we can decrease the cost of living. And the truth is that in many respects, the power of politicians to decrease the prices of electricity or decrease the price of groceries is very, very limited. And I'd like to see more emphasis placed upon put more emphasis on rising wages of working people and how we can actually make a contribution towards increasing their incomes so they can afford the costs. I think the union movement needs to do a whole lot better in marketing itself as the key service or the key product that they can provide is actually addressing the issue of income inequality. There is an enormous opportunity that is going completely begging at the moment, in my view, for the union movement to define itself by this issue of income inequality. The union movement focuses attention on a whole range of very, very important issues around the place. Lots of them important social issues, and for that I think the trade union movement has got an incredibly proud record. But I think now is the time for the movement to be throwing the kitchen sink at core business, doing everything we can to make sure that Australians are attracted to the union movement because they see it as being able to deliver an outcome for their own personal wages. And I think we have failed as a movement to do that as best as we possibly could, and I can speak a lot about that. But the second thing is, I'd like to see more done by the trade union movement and the governments generally to see what we can do in order to get more capital in the hands of working people in the form of share ownership plans. I think I saw a statistic the other day that share ownership by employees of companies that they work for is somewhere between 5 and 10% of Australians, and that strikes me as an incredibly low figure. And I'd like to see more of an opportunity for ordinary working people to have a genuine stake in the business that they work for. And I think there are some ideas around the place about how you can do that in terms of taxation reform and so forth. But we need to be able to make an argument to workers themselves why it's in their interests for them to have a piece of capital in the business that they work for.
So one of the things that you often notice in politics is people on the Conservative side who've come in as successful business leaders and apply exactly the same philosophy to government. It comes up particularly on the issue of wages, because the typical firm would like to have poor workers but rich consumers. And so if you come in with that philosophy to a country and you say, now the key here is just to drive down the wages and make us competitive, the problem is that the overall wage level is also the overall spending level. Peter's going to see this particularly with the industries in which he unionises, in which the workers at Coles and Woolworths are, many of them are shoppers at Coles and Woolworths. But we can't keep on going with this race to the bottom, this idea that Australia's success in the globalised economy will be to engage in wage competition with the Asian region. Because Australians don't want to live like that. They want the mix of good social services. They want a national disability insurance scheme, decent schools, decent hospitals, and the ability to go to a GP without pulling out your credit card. And for that, we have higher levels of taxes than most countries in the region, and we pay higher wages, and that ought to be a source of pride rather than a source of shame.
I think we've talked a little bit about the need to protect people who are in the middle and the lower end of the labour market, and that is just so important, and unions are really at the heart of that. And I say that as someone who I have a background in business, not in unions, but when I look at the evidence shows that in countries where unionism is strong, inequality is lower. And in fact, an IMF paper came out last year that suggested that about half the increase in inequality in OECD countries can be attributed to declining unionism alone. So it's a really, really important part of the answer here. So I think there's another set of things that are around how government regulates minimum standards for people at the bottom. So when we see the economy changing in a way that gives bigger rewards to people at the top, it's also giving lower rewards to people at the bottom. So we see, for example, that only 65% of Australians today work in a traditional arrangement where they get paid and sick leave, and 35% have an arrangement that gives them less social protection. A final point just on the minimum wage. So we also see the minimum wage is declining as a share of the average wage, also as a share of the median wage for those who are interested in the difference. So we've seen it go from about 60% of the average wage roughly 20 years ago to around 45% of the average wage today. And these are all things that government inherently has a bit of control over. So there's a story about protecting people at the bottom, but the other thing I really want to emphasise is the need for us to make policy change so that as many people as possible aren't fighting it out for a job at the bottom, but have choices that will enable them to get a job that they want. As you said, to a degree, their own terms and conditions. And again, this is about an education story. So our education is not fit for purpose right now. We can see year by year our standards in our primary and secondary schools are declining compared to countries that we are competing with. And we're going to have to ask ourselves a difficult question about what is it that young people in Australia are going to be able to do in 30 years' time that our Asian neighbours aren't going to be able to do better and more cheaply. That's the cold reality. And so we have to answer that question as well when we're looking into the medium term and thinking about the inequality problem.
Inherently, actually tightening up the superannuation tax concessions will have the biggest impact, because it has the biggest impact on the budget, so therefore by definition has the biggest impact on redistribution. So if you force me to pick one thing, that would be it, and the suggestions we've made are that you would restrict the amount that you can put in out of pre-taxed income to $10,000 a year, which we think is a more elegant version than the one that's been suggested by others in the by people in the Labor Party. Apart from anything else, it actually. And in particular, the thing I like about it is that it actually leads to those on very high incomes actually paying even more tax. And the reality is that those on really high incomes do not need tax breaks to encourage them to save. They are living on 150 grand a year at least as a family. They have probably for 20 or 30 years. They are not planning to retire onto the age pension of $30,000 a year. That is not plan A for those families. They are always going to save for their retirement, irrespective of what incentives government provides for them. So if I'm only allowed to pick one thing, that would be it. I mean, we do have an age-based tax and welfare system that basically says if you are old and rich, you pay even less tax than those who are young and rich, and I think that that's a problem, and that's where I'd start.
I have a really strongly felt answer to this question, and that is about early learning. So when we think about the way that we've talked about economic change occurring, we're talking about how do we get all Australians an opportunity at benefiting from growing economic prosperity. And when we look at the performance of our school system, lots of progressive people think of education as a silver bullet, and this is where we have the great meritocracy and the smart kids get to the top of the class and that sort of thing. The evidence just suggests that that's not really happening today in our education system. So there are certainly kids at the margins who are moving, in low-income households at the top of their class. I'm not saying that's not the case. But on average, kids come into primary school from lower income households at a lower level of development than kids in higher income households, and that gap grows through the education system. It doesn't get smaller. So we've got a major problem here. The only social intervention that I'm aware of that can change that and get kids to start school on the first day of school at an equal level is giving them fantastic quality early learning, the best quality early learning for the kids in the lowest income households. In Australia, we are, despite huge improvements under the red and yellow governments, we're one of the worst performers in the OECD. So the percent of Australian 3-year-olds who are enrolled in early learning is at about 18%, whereas world-leading countries, they have effectively universal enrolment of 3-year-old kids. We also know that the kids who don't access early learning are more likely to be disadvantaged in some other way, and the disadvantaged kids that do access early learning get a lower quality of care than kids in high income households. So we have to sort this problem out, and if we do it, we'll get massive bang for buck.
I'm going to follow on Claire's theme because I think she's right on the money. If there was one thing, was your question specifically in regard to the budget? Was it?
No, you can touch on the budget.
Oh, look, generally, I'd like to see us get back on track and put in place the Gonski reforms that were proposed, and that both parties were on a unity ticket for in the lead up to the last election. I read the other day, the best case study, I think, anywhere in the world for the consequences of growing income inequality is, of course, in the United States. All the evidence about the implications or the impact of income inequality on educational outcomes in America are now going through the roof in terms of the detrimental impacts it has. An American male who was between the age of 25 and 34 is now less likely to have a university education than his own father. And that is a statistic that, of course, flies in the face of everything that we've been trying to achieve in the West for a long time. And I fear that such a prospect could happen here in Australia, not to the same extent in any time soon. But Gonski, at its heart, really was about ensuring that we do have a merit-based educational system that, of course, no matter what postcode you grow up in, you're going to have a good chance of getting a decent education. It's an absolute no-brainer. It's got the support of the entire community, even if they don't really understand what Gonski means. And the sooner it can happen in Australia, the better.
So yes to superannuation tax reform, though maybe in a more inelegant form. Definitely yes to quality early childhood education, and yes to needs-based school funding. But if I had to pick one big idea, I would envisage the way in which a future federal Labor government brings inequality to the cabinet table. We currently have regulatory impact statements, environmental impact statements, health impact statements that are applied to new ideas, new policies that are brought forward. And at a time when inequality is as high as it's been in 75 years, I think it's reasonable to ask whether you'd also want some sort of an inequality impact statement. I haven't thought about exactly how it would work. Tony Atkinson has some terrific ideas in his new book, Inequality, What Is to Be Done, which, if you enjoyed Piketty's 700-pager, you'll enjoy Atkinson's 400-pager. But it is, I think, a notion worth focusing on. Do we want some sort of formal or informal inequality assessment in which a Labor cabinet asks of every policy proposal, is this going to widen or narrow the gap between rich and poor?